Hi, everyone.
Hi.
It's been a year. I work from home building websites, and I'm not in love with it, but it's what I do, and it got me here. It allows me to travel while I work. Every place I go, I still have a job. The work is stressful, and I don't talk to people most of the day, so I developed some bad habits that if I actually were to start working in an office again, I would probably have to break. And probably the worst one at this point isn't that I talk to myself, it's that when I get really stressed out, I scream at the top of my lungs. and it isn't like a road rage, like word scream where you go, fuck this or fuck it, because that's anger and that doesn't feel good. This is like something that I do, it's just a sound, and I always imagine something terrible happening inside my head when I do it, and it immediately makes me feel better. And it sounds, it's like I'd like to put my hand here and act like suddenly all of my head catches on fire, and I make a noise that goes like something like this. Ah! And then I usually giggle kind of darkly, and then I get back to work and I feel better.
I gotta try that.
Yeah, I mean, it's another bad habit is telling people things you do that you probably shouldn't do. Anyway, I sit at my desk, and occasionally, there'll be all these emails will come in at once. They always come in all at once, and the thing will go ding, 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 ding. And some of my clients have they'll text me, and they'll be like, Jeff, can you get this done? Can you get this done? And my phone will ring, and I'll be stuck on something I don't have, and it feels so good to just, when I'm sitting there, just to imagine like suddenly a pair of legs growing in my brain and it throwing itself against the side of my skull, or something very cartoony, awful, someone grabbing my brain stem and just yanking on it and then just going, ah! Ah! And I'm sure my neighbors hate this. I'm sure that they absolutely hate this. I also, when I go out to coffee shops, have to worry about not doing it. So I have to sit there, and if I get stressed out in the coffee shop, I have to kind of silently do it. What this means, though, is that when I do finally get to meet my clients, sometimes I've worked with them for over a year, and I feel kind of uncomfortable because I know they've emailed me at times when I was stressed out, and I screamed like I was having an aneurysm, or I thought weird stuff while I was working, or said it out loud. So when I lived here for a week, when I first came here, I'd been here for about a week. It wasn't actually a week. I'd actually been here for 3 or 4 months on a sublease, but it was my first week that I actually had my own place. It was my first apartment. I had moved out of the sublease, so I felt like I was finally living here. So it was my first week in New York. And I had a client that I had never met. She was a Portuguese journalist who had her own site, and she lived in Roosevelt Island. And she was friends with another client of mine who's a painter, who's also Portuguese, named Luis Vilela, who I also built a website for. And they invited me out to Roosevelt Island, where I had never been, to meet them. So I was nervous going there because I when you spend all day alone, you start to question whether you're good at talking to people. And I got there, and they invited me up to the roof of this apartment building on Roosevelt Island, and they had this little setup of wine and food and a bunch of their friends they wanted me to meet to talk about doing websites. And I was pretty good at the small talk. They asked me, how long have you been here? And I said, well, a week, kind of. I've been here a couple months, actually, but it's kind of weird. But I did all right with it. But eventually, I ended up talking to Luis, and he's this very talented painter. I would describe him of what he looked like as a person, but actually his painting is so vivid and so great. The best way I can do to explain it is to start talking about when I learned to draw, which I'm not any good at. One of my friends who's good at it told me it's all made up of lines, and you just have to make every line correct. And if you make every line correct, you get a good drawing. So I discovered that, I bullshit every line, and then I would still end up with a drawing that looked kind of like it. And then I started to respect people who knew what they were actually doing more and had that detail. And Luis, it's like he looks at the world with his paintings, and they're all figure paintings, but it's like he gets to recreate everything out of his own lines, and it still looks like the thing. And I ended up talking to him on the roof. It was the first time I'd ever met him in person. And he said something that was great for my imagination, where he said, "What's your favorite building in New York City?" And I was standing on this roof looking at the entire Manhattan skyline from the tip down, my first week here, basically. From the tip down Financial District all the way up Central Park, up to the Upper East Side. And I said, well, I don't really have one. And he said, well, you need to choose a favorite building in New York City, because when you see it, it'll be the building that makes you happy.
Oh.
And I thought, wow, that's a lot of pressure. And, because you don't want to pick the Empire State Building, because you're going to see it all the time. And then it's going to become like that chipper friend who's always like, you need to cheer up. And then you're going to start to resent your favorite building in New York. And you don't want to pick one that's way up in Harlem, because I lived in Brooklyn at this point. I just moved there, because then I'd have to travel an hour and a half to go see the thing that made me happy whenever and it just wouldn't be worth it. I'd get there and be like, thanks for making me come up to your favorite building. And maybe I was even facing the wrong way. Maybe I needed to be facing Brooklyn, since that's where I was staying at this point. So I started thinking about other places I had lived, and I realized that I didn't have any favorite buildings from the past. I had favorite rooms that were in buildings. There's this room in the Children's Museum of Indianapolis that's on the top floor, that's nothing but little science exhibits that you can go into, where you get on an exercise bike and you see how fast you can pedal, and it turns on more and more appliances the faster you pedal it. Where you sit on a chair and they hand you a wheel and they spin it, and as you turn it, it turns you on the little chair, and you get to understand how that works. Or when I lived in Morgantown, there's a place called the Metropolitan Theater, which is an old movie theater, like there are in a lot of old towns. But when you go downstairs, there's this 2-story basement, 2 stories, and it's the entire basement, and it's just filled wall to wall with pool tables, and the markers above all the pool tables are just hanging on these incredibly old wires that have been there. And I remember going there with my friend Brad Piggott, and I remember my parents taking me to the Children's Museum. And I remember laughing with friends in this one incredible room that we had in this house in Kyle, Texas, that had this accordion ceiling. And it was this old Ma Bell-owned house. And I was thinking of rooms. I wasn't thinking of buildings. And I may have asked Luis, I may have said to him, what's your favorite building? Or I may have just kind of stood there quietly staring and lost in my own head, because I worked for myself. But he told me it was the Chrysler Building. And I turned and I looked at it, and it was as if it hadn't been lit up before. Now it was. And I feel like it wasn't, and then it was. And I stared at it, and I could kind of imagine it in the way that he paints, with the blues and yellows actually coming through it a little bit, and the way that he would paint it. So now I've been here for about 3 years, give or take. Actually, about 4 years, give or take a few months. And as I go around, I still don't have a favorite building, but I have favorite rooms. I like the basement of the Three of Cups, which is where Philip Jombry has his show. And there's a little Belgian bar called the Belgian Room, where I met my friend Felicity Kitson, who's here. And there's this room, which I get to go to tell stories often, or host and get some of my favorite friends up here. And now when I walk around New York occasionally, quite often actually, I see the Chrysler Building. It's a building you see all the time. But it doesn't bother me, because when I see it, I think, that's Luis Vilela's favorite building, and it makes him happy. And that's pretty incredible, because I met him because of my job, which is a pretty good one. You guys have a good one.